In the lead up to the release of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, most commentary focused on its likely implications for the debate about climate change. And clearly an effort to influence that discussion was part of the encyclical's intent. My own view is that the longer-term significance of this encyclical will have much less to do with specific policies concerning the environment or the economy. I think the longer-term significance will have to do with its theological reflections, the way in which it reflects theologically upon the human person and human community's relationship with the natural world. And in some respects, Laudato Si does not say that much which is new in this area. It really re-articulates the theme that we find in Genesis, which is that man is given dominion over the earth, but this dominion must be exercised according to the responsibilities associated with stewardship and with obedience to the divine and natural law. These themes, of course, as Father Augusto pointed out, have been developed by St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Pope Francis. I happen to think that the theology of creation, which really, as Father Augusto said, brings together the Hebrew and Christian scriptures to think about the nature of creation and the human person's relation to it, as well as the theme of integral ecology, will be very important when it comes to deeper theological reflection upon society and individuals' relationship with the natural world. Now, in the lead up to this event, one of the things I noticed on the advertising for this event was that this encyclical had been well received by many people, but had been less well received by many people working in the business community and those people who are working in market economies. Well, I don't think we should be too surprised by that reaction, because I think if you read the encyclical, there's a genuinely negative view of free markets that's articulated in the encyclical. I'm going to say something about that, which I've said in other places. Then I'm going to turn to say some positive things about how Pope Francis's vision for the human person's relationship with the environment can be further extended. Now, Pope Francis has made many criticisms, as we all know, about the global economy. That's very clear in Evangelii Gaudium, and he repeats, and in some respects goes even further in Laudato Si. Now, there's of course many things that he says about the global economy in that document which I think are spot on. For example, he criticizes the bailing out of banks and financial houses by governments. He says this is a problem. And does anyone really doubt that if the world faces another financial crisis, that we'll find governments behaving in exactly the same way, thereby reinforcing the moral hazard problem, which we know is part of the issue? The encyclical also suggests, correctly in my view, that despite the events of 2008, there really has not been a significant and meaningful reform of the world's financial systems. I think that's exactly true. I also think that the Pope's very tough words for those who regard population growth as somehow necessarily damaging the environment and impending economic development, I think the critiques of those sorts of arguments, I think, are spot on. Now, let me turn to some of the critique I have of the encyclical itself. I do think there are some conceptual problems, and there are some problems concerning the empirical evidence to which it refers. So as I mentioned at a seminar at Oxford yesterday, when you think about environmental degradation, Laudato Si seems oblivious to the fact that the worst economically driven pollution and environmental degradation that happened in the 20th century was, of course, the result of centrally planned state industrial schemes in former communist countries. Anyone who's visited Eastern Europe, anyone who's been to the former Soviet Union, you know this. You can see it in the landscape, what's happened as a result of centrally planned economies and state industrialization schemes. But this is not mentioned in the encyclical, and I think that's a problem. I think another difficulty, which also explains, I think, some of the less enthusiastic reaction among some people to the encyclical, is I think there's an oversimplification of the way the encyclical portrays those people like myself who believe that free markets are generally the most optimal way forward when it comes to economic development for individuals and for the world more generally. So, for example, the encyclical says in paragraph 109, it says, quote, "Some circles maintain that current economics and technology will solve all environmental problems and argue that in popular and non-technical terms that the problems of global hunger and poverty will be reduced simply by market growth." Well, growth is, of course, indispensable if we want to save people from poverty. There's no other way to do it. Growth is absolutely essential. There's no long-term remedy to poverty without economic growth. And markets have an unmatched ability to provide that growth. That's why we've seen over the past 40 years more than 1 billion people escape poverty. These are things that should be celebrated, but interestingly, that is not mentioned in the encyclical. Another thing which I think is also very important is that when we think about the ways in which markets operate, we need to remember that they will only work if certain moral, cultural, and legal settings are in place. I'm going to say more about this towards the end when I get to some positive things I think the encyclical can lead us to think about. But this is extremely important when it comes to economic development. And if you don't have rule of law, which is the case, as we all know, in much of the world, particularly in Latin America, and if we don't have vibrant civil societies, then I think we can see some very negative things starting to happen. And free market advocates have been making that point for a very, very long time. Rule of law is much more important for economic development than something like democracy. Another problem, I think, with the encyclical, which is more of a thematic thing. When you read the encyclical, you almost get the sense that the drafters of the text wish the Industrial Revolution had never happened. You read the document, that more or less comes out. And I think that's a shame. And the reason I think that's a shame is because the Industrial Revolution, of course, was the event that began the process of extending lifespans, of improving levels of health, of leading to greater material prosperity for ever-widening circles of people. Now, there were negative aspects to the Industrial Revolution, and Laudato Si does talk about that in terms of some of the pollution that happened as a result of that. But I think we should be very careful before we more or less look at entire periods of history and cast doubt upon whether that particular development, the Industrial Revolution, was generally something that is viewed negatively. So I think that's a problem. Let me move on to say more in the remaining time that I have about some of the positive ways in which I think the encyclical can help us to think about these things. And this particularly comes to what you might call non-state solutions to some of these problems. So Father Gustavo mentioned that the Pope talks Augusto, talked a great deal about how the Pope referred to the ways in which good policies and the responsibilities of politicians when it comes to dealing with some of these problems. That's all true. But I do think there is a lot of room to explore when it comes to, for example, private property solutions to lots of forms of environmental degradation. Professor Philip Booth, who's here tonight, has written extensively on this theme. And interestingly enough, what some people who are working in this area are suggesting is that if you go back and you look at the work of Thomas Aquinas and the way that he talked about private property, he talked about private property obviously not being an absolute. We know that. Life is more important than material things. But private property is something that provides incentives, and those incentives can be aligned in the right ways when it comes to promoting the environment. It solves the problem of the tragedy of the commons. So I was in the village of Buenos Aires 2 months ago, and you notice in the barrios, in the villa miserias as they're called, you see a great deal of poverty, you also see a great deal of environmental degradation. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that property rights are insecure, no one knows who owns what, rule of law is tremendously weak throughout Argentina. So what this means is that the institutional frameworks that would allow more and more people to take responsibility for parts of the world that they do own are missing. So to that extent, I think, provided that you do have these institutional supports, I think there are many ways in which we can explore private solutions to some of these problems. And a great deal of work has been done in the United States on this particular subject by economists, free market economists, who are very committed to environmental preservation, but who also think that state solutions to these problems often have unintended consequences. The last thing I would say is another good example of someone who thought about these questions very seriously and advocated private solutions to some of these problems was, of course, the German economist and Christian, the architect of the German economic miracle, Wilhelm Röpke. And he wrote about this in the context of Switzerland, and he looked around and said, this country I'm living in is incredibly wealthy, it's incredibly prosperous, but it also has this wonderful environment. Why is that the case? And what his research showed was that because there was such widespread ownership of property, there was so much, as a consequence of that, there was a great deal of willingness to people to take responsibility for things that they owned. Now, there are certainly some cultural things to this. The Swiss like their mountains, they like their snow and all that. But the point was that the institutional and cultural framework was in place whereby these private solutions became real options so that one could have the type of economic development that the Pope obviously wants to get people out of poverty, while also preserving the environment in ways that indicate a respect for the natural world. And in many respects, I think it reflects the type of integral ecology that Pope Francis is calling for in this encyclical. Thank you.